A lot of the differences with these guys may seem completely obvious, but stacking them up next to each other is honestly completely sobering. We've come a long way, guys, and we're not even talking about other advancements in PC stuff and online infrastructure that gaming has seen today. Last time we did this, people memed us and said we were stupid, but they didn't actually watch the video. We're comparing these things not because it makes sense, because obviously it doesn't, but because it's fun. We decided on comparing the Switch to the N64 because we saw some weird similarities you might actually like. So let's take a trip down memory lane real quick. The Nintendo 64 was released in June of 1996 in Japan and September 1996 in North America, jumping into a market that had already had the original PlayStation. Thankfully, with the power of Nintendo behind it, it still managed to completely hold its own. Nintendo's processing unit was a custom NEC VR4300. It's about as powerful as your average desktop Pentium chip at the time, and for the few uninitiated that don't know, the 64 in Nintendo 64 was coined because it was capable of operating 64-bit processes, although most games took advantage of the still capable 32-bit to save memory, something that was in short supply with this console. But speaking of memory, the Nintendo 64 had 4 megabytes of RAM, which was expandable to 8 megabytes with the expansion pack. Yes, that's 8 megabytes, while the average regular consumer computer now has 8 gigs of RAM usually. The Nintendo 64 had no built-in memory storage otherwise. Now on the Nintendo Switch side, you guys probably know the Nintendo Switch isn't exactly a graphical powerhouse. On a technical scale, it can't even keep up with the big boys like PS4, Xbox, or PC, but it is rocking an NVIDIA Tegra style system on chip, estimated to be X1 based, meaning roughly quad core with CPU cores clocked up to 2 GHz. This rough estimate of specs changes with the dock factored in. The dock powers the console and possibly changes the clock speed, but we'll get around to that dock later. The Nintendo Switch has 4 GB of LPDDR4 DRAM. That's compared to, like I said earlier, the Nintendo 64's standard 4 megabytes. If that's not staggering to you, oof. But what I do want to point out in terms of hardware is that while Nintendo Switch has Bluetooth and it doesn't really support Bluetooth headphones, it does still have a 3.5 standard headphone jack, something that we totally take for granted now and something that the Nintendo 64 didn't even have. And honestly, I don't think anyone thought twice about it back in 1996. Nintendo 64 supported output at composite and S-video at resolutions from 320 by 240 up to 640 by 480 pixels. Those larger resolutions usually needed the expansion pack upgrades. You remember those? The few games that were packaged with the expansion pack look better, and that's part of the reason why. The Nintendo Switch has a 6.2-inch 720p touchscreen itself. It's not the most advanced, but in comparison to its way older brother, it's pretty amazing. And then when docked, the Switch can output up to 1080p. Specs aside, it should go without saying that this is worlds different between the two. Look at this, look at Zelda. Ports-wise, while Nintendo 64 relied on proprietary controller ports and such, the Switch is wireless and supports USB 2.0 and 3.0, as well as charging with the newer USB-C standard, which manages data and power unlike anything anyone has ever seen in 1996. The Nintendo Switch has 32 gigabytes of onboard memory, which absolutely blows the pants off Nintendo 64, but by today's standards is really considered kind of paltry. 32 gigs, that's like enough to store one very large game and that's it. It can, however, be expanded with micro SD cards, something that didn't even exist until 2004. Nintendo 64 had expandable memory cards for the controllers, but some of the better games saved right on the cartridge. Speaking of cartridges, the Nintendo 64's cartridges were, at the time, cartridges' last hurrah. Technically, it was the last home consumer console to use cartridges as the main media type. The size with them was extremely limiting to game developers at the time because as games moved to 3D, more space was needed. The rise of disk memory with the success of the PS1 was a real thing, but Nintendo 64 cartridges packed up to 64 megabytes depending on the game. While the size wasn't huge, the memory loaded fast, which was a pretty nice trade-off. It's funny how Nintendo circles back around in 2017 from 1996 as the Nintendo Switch embraces cartridges once again. These smaller cartridges, Nintendo calls game cards, are non-writable cards with a capacity up to 32 gigabytes. The Switch connects to Wi-Fi, and Nintendo does have a digital eShop store in a nod to the future, and has been making waves by being region-free, but the novelty of cartridges for physical users is kinda nice. It's also something that the 3DS and previous portable handhelds from Nintendo never really ditched in the first place. Now, comparing the controllers is a bit interesting thanks to the Switch's multiple modes. It's also interesting because the N64 controller is one of the most unconventional mainstream controllers we've ever seen. You can hold it in different ways, and many games handle it completely different. It was a polarizing controller for sure. Some people love it, some people hate it. The Joy-Con controllers seem to be surprisingly similar in their divisiveness. Since they're designed for portability, many find them too small or cramped for prolonged use and opt for the Pro controller. While button placement isn't perfect, it still makes more sense and is a bit more modern than the Nintendo 64's. The Joy-Cons are loaded with features, gyroscopes for motion control, a new form of vibration with that HD rumble nonsense, and an IR sensor. The added complications and wireless factor leads to the notorious controller disconnect problem you've probably heard about, a problem that a wired Nintendo 64 controller would never have. The real elephant in the room in terms of comparison's sake is that one is a home console and the other is hybrid, with the portability of the Switch and the dock. Having a portable tablet-like console that drops into a dock and instantly turns into a traditional game is a pretty novel feature. It does make for an extremely different experience, one that we're honestly enjoying despite some real quirks and issues here and there. It's definitely not perfect, but it is interesting. And to see the Switch, a gray utilitarian design thing that uses cartridges, next to a Nintendo 64, a gray utilitarian design thing that uses cartridges, it just really seems like things have come full circle. And while many people are enjoying the Switch and Zelda and all that, I gotta acknowledge just how popular the Nintendo 64 still is. It's a game console from a simpler time, no charging needed, no disconnects, no updates, DLC, or long downloads to play a game. People still pick up and play this thing all the time for Mario Party, Mario 64, Super Smash Bros., etc., etc. I've noticed that it's particularly popular still with casual gamers in their 20s. Many people I've known, maybe grown up with in the neighborhood, who aren't really into video games anymore, still have the Nintendo 64 from childhood that they bust out for parties. It's something I never would have expected seeing, but honestly, I'm glad I do. And I think the same goes for how the Switch attempts to change how we play games and how people really embrace it. But the Switch's future is still uncertain. Will it remain in our hearts like Nintendo 64? I think that's up for time to decide. But when we do these silly comparison videos, it's really a conversation starter. We want to know what you guys think in the comments. If you've had both a Switch and Nintendo 64, be honest. What are you having more fun with? Do you have any fond memories from a Nintendo 64 growing up? Maybe if you didn't have one, maybe your friend did, or maybe you wanted one really bad. And if you've held both controllers, let us know which controller do you like better, the N64 controller or a Joy-Con grip controller. Let's talk about any of this stuff and maybe even reminisce a little down in the comments below. I'll be down there talking to you guys, and I'll also be on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Jake Baldino as well. Thanks for coming around for our silly little dumb comparison video. Clicking that like button definitely helps us out a ton, and we totally appreciate it. And if for some reason you're new, subscribing is a thing you should have done already. But as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you guys next time.